The US gained the USSR's support during the Second World War because Hitler betrayed the USSR with Operation Barbarossa. What happened to the US USSR relationship after the war? Why did they start a new rivalry or Cold War? I mean, a great question. They used to be allies, right? What happened? So, the the Germans, the Nazis, who obviously were led by Hitler, they had essentially a pact, a non aggression pact with the USSR of Joseph Stalin. It was called the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact. This was a non aggression pact, kind of not really an alliance, but we won't fight each other, that sort of thing. And that was kind of the precursor, it kind of made things easy for Hitler for a while. So they had this pact, the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact. And what was it, 1941, 42, whenever it was, Operation Barbarossa was launched. Hitler decided, now that pact is torn to pieces and I'm going to invade the USSR. He did not wait to finish the job with England. Yeah. He decided, okay, forget about England, let's go to the USSR. If he had finished England off, which was possible, then it would have been possibly a different story. And even with Operation Barbarossa, instead of going straight for Moscow, he went for the Caucasus, where you had oil and gas, and he wanted that. But that allowed the USSR to regroup. Anyway, that's a long story. The point is that during the Second World War, the Soviet Union, after Operation Barbarossa, was on the defensive. Initially, Operation Barbarossa was a huge success. The Germans made tremendous progress. They essentially eventually reached the outskirts of Moscow. They could see Moscow through binoculars. Yeah, but that's where grand old general of Russia comes in, General Winter, and that's when everything changed. But when the USSR was on the back foot and they were being hammered by the Nazis, they formed an alliance with the United States. The United States eventually did enter the war after a period of dilly dallying, and they were allies with the USSR, and they did provide a lot of support, material support, etc., to the USSR. And the objective was to defeat Adolf Hitler, right? And then eventually the Soviets start pushing forward, surging forward, and most of the fighting and most of the dying in the war was done by the USSR. The USSR, they lost about more than 20, maybe 27 million men in the war effort. There must have been women, obviously, also, but mostly I would say soldiers, right? And in order to win the war, they had to develop this massive industrial complex. And the Soviets had an advantage the Germans did not have. They had inexhaustible land all the way to the far east of Asia. So they could afford to have factories deep in their interior, connect them with rail lines to the front, and that's how they started churning out the the weapons, arms, ammunition, machinery, all of that, aircraft, tanks, whatever that was needed for the war effort. And that created a massive industrial base for the USSR. Under Joseph Stalin, the USSR industrialized massively for the war effort. And that's how they were able to, at immense cost, at the cost of oceans of blood, they were able to defeat Nazi Germany. The American contribution is nothing compared to the Soviet contribution in winning the war. The Soviets also are accused of all kinds of brutalities and atrocities. Even the Allies did the same thing. Okay, let's not try and have somebody hold the moral high ground because you watch some Hollywood movie. Okay, that's not how the world works. So the US and the USSR were allies. The moment the war ends, they become enemies, right? The Cold War starts. Why? Because they were allies. It was an alliance of convenience. They were temporary allies because they had a common enemy. Once the common enemy was defeated, now you look at each other and you see something else. The US looks at the USSR, they see that this guy has enormous resources, huge amount of territory, massive industrial complex, massive military complex, very powerful armed force, hugely powerful military, thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, millions of soldiers, and inexhaustible land and resources. Autarky. Well, there was only one other nation like that, which was the US. They had acquired for themselves an entire continent, which they could rule. They acquired it from the natives by killing them. So they also had this, but the USSR had more resources, more material. So clearly, you can't be friends anymore. That's how the world works. So they became enemies, and that's the beginning of the rivalry, which is called the Cold War, because that's how it works in geopolitics, right?